Today, on a spiritual level of being, temple prostitutes. Going to discuss sacred prostitution, sacred sex rituals, and temple prostitutes, or sacred virgins as well. Now, this being said, prostitute was vastly used in the ancient time. Even a dancer could be considered a prostitute, or someone who worked in a tavern or temples as well. One who was dancing would be seen as selling their body for gold or even to God. So let's go on to this. The Bible mentions the words Zonah and Kadesha when describing prostitutes. Zonah meaning regular street prostitute. Kadesha meaning sacred, trustworthy, respected, being temple prostitutes that date back to the lands of Canaan and the Canaanite temple fertility gods and the fertility temples. Now, this being said, in some cases, temple prostitutes were even placed outside of the temple in order to lure more people into the temples. So they were given gold, and in turn they would donate it to the temple, and in turn this would be how they would sustain the temple, and also how they would in turn eat, drink, and take care of themselves. Now, Kadesha can also refer to as male dancers, who were also associated with sacred prostitution. Now, Roman authors such as Valerius Maximus describes how the Phoenician Canaanite women, the temple prostitutes, were so popular that people would travel all across different nations to give them lavish gifts just to spend time with them. Now, young women were also raised in the temples. We also find this in the Judean customs, where they would raise them up as temple virgins and then marry them often to nobility or to the priestly class. We would also find this custom in ancient Canaan. So the Canaanites themselves would also practice temple prostitution, as they were the Jewish ancestors. Now, in some cases, some of the children that were born out of these temple prostitutes were also sacrificed to Baal and even Yahweh. So let's continue. So in times when childbirth resulted in death, women were dying left, right and centre, and fertility was quite low in regards to today's time. Now, this being said, people did have lots of children compared to now. It's just that lots of the children would die. So because of this, these fertility rituals associated with temple prostitutes, sacred prostitution, were also viewed as pleasing the gods or God, and thus in turn would guarantee plentiful harvest and also plentiful fertility amongst their country and city. So in chance as well that these temple prostitutes could also have a chance of sleeping with the gods, who in turn would take on human form. Now, this was also done in order to guarantee a plentiful harvest, to guarantee good luck. So this in turn could be a chance of giving birth to a divine child, a God-man or God-child. So in turn, this would bring favour to their nation, to their people, and in turn could bring about great men of renown into the world. This could also be associated with the temple virgins of ancient Judea, where in hopes one of these young girls raised in the temple would give birth to the Messiah or the Son of God. Now, in the Baal sacrificing of child sacrifice, some of these were temple prostitutes' children, and in turn, these divine children, in sense, were seen as worthy sacrifices, the ultimate sacrifices. Though that being said, some villagers also even sacrificed their children in turn if they couldn't afford an offering, or in turn they would offer their child to serve the temple, and this could be young girls or young boys. Young boys would be raised into the priestly class or maybe into male dancers, while the females would be turned into either priestesses, wives, or even temple prostitutes. Now, the sex rituals were often practiced with incense. Temple drugs were also given to the women, or even at rare cases, sometimes the visitor partaking within these ancient ritual practices of ancient sex worship. Now, this in turn would be done in order to please the gods, and this could be also done with prayer and chanting, and a way of telling prophecies in one's own future, also enacting one to be able to physically have sex with a goddess or even a god. In ancient Egypt, there were also temple prostitutes, such as the ones found in the temples dedicated to the goddess Hathor. Now, these temple prostitutes were often slaves offered to the temple in order for noble families to gain political support, momentum, and business support, as the high priest and priestesses of these temples were often powerful politicians in their own right, and would even sway the political courts and had influence over the kings and generals. Now, it was even believed that having relations with one of these temple prostitutes could bring about blessings, good luck to you and the village and to your country. Now, these were often women, but sometimes they could even be men. Now, they could be young, teenagers, or even old. Now, selling one's body in ancient Egypt was not very common, as women were married young and were expected to marry young and have families, as this was considered honourable and sacred, and it was a huge deal to have a family in ancient Egypt. Now, the workers in the temples of ancient Egypt were also the caretakers of the temple. The temple was also a place for one to learn, to pray, to learn the ancient mythologies, how to read and write, and even play music. This was all means of honouring the gods. Even sex was also seen as a means of worship. Now, the Sumerians and Babylonians also had a means of sexual worship, to which this was dedicated to the goddess Inanna and Ishtar, the goddess of love and sex, to which they would encourage a woman at least once in her life to wait outside the goddess temple and to there pick up a male, a random man, and offer her services sexually for a few gold coins. After the intercourse was done, she would go home, wash herself, and then donate the coins to the temple. This was seen as a means of offering and also sacred worship, so sex worship. Now, this was also done in a means to guarantee blessings upon the woman, the community, the temple, and also the country itself. So this is quite interesting. This was also seen as a way of possibly not only honouring the gods, but also possibly having sex with a god who chose to take on human form. In ancient Greece, there was also sacred prostitution, temple prostitutes and holy virgins, of both male and females alike. Now, this being said, the term hierodule, which was thought to mean holy woman or sacred holy woman, which actually means slave to God or in servitude to a god or goddess or the gods in the temple. They were former slaves given as an offering to the temple and thus becoming temple prostitutes. Not all were slaves. Some were given as offering to the temples from noble families as young girls or young boys. Sometimes women were forced into prostitution to serve at the temples for punishment for adultery. The term hierodule, which was thought to mean holy sacred woman, means slave to God, thus meaning a former slave being now as a slave to a god, goddess, and the temple itself. So their job was to take care of the temple. They were their caretakers, and thus the money they would make while performing sacred sex and ritual prayer, they would then in turn offer it to the temple, which in turn would feed them and clothe them, and they were also allowed to receive gifts. Now, within ancient Greece, the temple prostitutions also had rank. There were the heteres, which were also called the courtesans, which were well-educated temple prostitutes. They were belonging to noble families or well-educated slaves from distant conquered tribes, etc. And they were raised in the temple quite young, and thus they would serve the upper class, the nobles, and be used for the more sacred temple rituals. Now, they would be also visiting the wealthy guest for offering their services, and thus would be given much more lavish gifts and would be much more expensive to spend time with. There were also the hierodules, which were the older slave women and also the less educated. So ones who were previously slaves or forced into prostitution for punishment for adultery. They were there to serve the lower class and middle class and would even be used in public sex rituals. Now, female ancient sacred prostitutes in Greece were seen as more desirable for their fertility purposes, as they could also give birth, and fertility was also viewed as sacred and a gift for the gods, and thus a female was seen more desirable for, say, a visiting god such as Zeus. Now, even Aphrodite. Now, some prostitutes were also made to dress differently to basically disassociate them from their gender, as Aphrodite was of both masculine and feminine qualities. Now, some people would even offer their children to the temples for service, and thus would also be seen as being given a blessing from the gods themselves, and thus in turn would also see to bless the city with fertility. Now, it was also seen that some of these children could turn out to be divine, as it could be a wandering god that impregnated one of the temple prostitutes, and thus this divine child could be like Hercules and be a man of great renown. So the idea of god-men or children of the gods was nothing new, especially in ancient Greek mythology, where Zeus was also known to have affairs with mortal women. Now, some people would even offer themselves to the temple as a means of worship, viewing this as sacred sex, though most men in general in ancient Greece wouldn't want to marry these women after their temple services. This being said, The most socially accepted temple prostitutes were those at the temple at Corniff of Aphrodite. Now, there, it said they reached over 1,000 members of both male and females. There, these sex rituals would take place with an annual sex ritual, and it was said that these rituals would guarantee bountiful fertility amongst the cities and throughout Greece, and it would also bring about divine blessings and pleasing the gods and Aphrodite. Now, during these sex rituals, after payment was made, of which could reach up to 1,000 drachmas, depending on the female or male, whether educated or not, after this, incense would be burned, a sex ritual would take place while chanting and praying would go on, and at times the prostitutes were given psychedelic drugs, and sometimes even those who were participating within this ritual, depending on the circumstance, whether it was for divine prophecy and whatnot. Now, this could also be for entertainment purposes as well, so this is interesting. Now, the payment of 1,000 drachmas would have been those at Corniff especially, or even in Cyprus, where it was said that men would travel around the world to spend time with these temple prostitutes. Now, after the intercourse was made, the temple prostitute would then go to the bathhouse, which was also accessible to the temple, as it was a temple bathhouse as well, to where they would ritually cleanse themselves and offer their payment or part of their payment to the temple. And in turn, this would help feed them, clothe them, and keep running the temple, as they were also the caretakers of the temple grounds. And within the temple itself, they would also be the ones there performing the rituals. Now, within ancient Rome, there was also sacred prostitution similar to Greece. There were also mystery schools that revolved around sacred sex rituals. There were also sacred virgins in ancient Rome. Now, the use of these sacred virgins and even the use of temple prostitutes was shut down around the 4th century during the Christian emperor reign of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. However, it's argued that he was Christian mixed with paganism, a mixture of Mithraism and Apollo worship. So Christians were pleased to see that these temple prostitutes were out of business, so that the temples were closed, and they were pleased to see that the pagan temple virgins were also ceasing to be. Let's discuss the Vestal virgins, who were chosen at the ages of 6 to 10 from noble families. Both parents had to be alive in order to offer their virgin daughter, and also they had to be freeborn citizens of Rome, to which the young girls were chosen by the emperor and by the high male priest of Rome. Their very existence was to keep alive Rome and the Roman Empire itself. They were also in charge of keeping alive the eternal flame to keep it burning. Now, if they were caught slacking off and the eternal flame went out, because they were always meant to be on guard watching the eternal flame to ensure it kept burning, they would be whipped, flogged. And if they broke their chastity vow, they in turn would be buried alive to ensure no blood to please the goddess Vesta. The male that seduced the virgin, in turn, would be publicly beaten to death. Now, during the 30 years of service, they would start off as students, to which they would learn the temple rituals and be educated, and then they would become servants of the temple, to which they would conduct the rituals, and then they would become teachers, in turn re-educating the younger girls, so that way they could in turn carry on their craft and continue the process of the Vestal virgins. Now, after their servitude had finished, they were free to marry. However, they were usually past the age of childbearing, so they were given a state pension to live on for the rest of their life. Many of them chose to stay in the temples and would then reenact their vows and continue the vow of virginity for the rest of their lives. Now, in ancient India, and even India today within Hinduism, there is sacred prostitution, sacred sex rituals as a means of worship. The Devasati, which were young girls offered by local villagers to serve the temple. They in turn would dedicate the rest of their lives to the temple, serving as temple prostitutes and those who were in charge of taking care of the temple. They in turn would sexually serve the high priest and villagers during sexual ceremonies. They in turn were educated in art and music, and they in turn would perform art and music and prayer during their rituals, which in turn they would perform these rituals naked. They in turn have even been said to be forced into prostitution, which is a horrible thing. Thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. Please like and subscribe. It helps get this information out there on YouTube, and it helps spread my channel. So many blessings. Connect to one and soul. Namaste.